For the past several weeks, world leaders have been meeting in Glasgow, Scotland, in what has been billed as the last best hope to prevent the growth or increase in climate change that the Earth has been seeing. Many who have observed this session, however, have questioned whether or not it has achieved any goals or whether any of the goals that it has achieved can actually be accomplished by the member states. My name is Dr. Sean Williams, and I am the lead professor and director of political science and director of the Kentucky Heartland Institute on Public Policy. And I have here joining me today three of our student panelists from our political science senior seminar class to discuss global warming and specifically to take a look at the effectiveness of state actors in trying to confront global warming itself. From top to bottom on my screen, I have joining us today with Milan Bailey. Milan, how are you doing this morning?
I'm good.
I also have Alyssa Wathen. Ms. Wathen, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
And last, of course, certainly not least, I have Haley Payton. Ms. Payton, how are you?
I'm good.
Glad to hear it. So first of all, let's get started. One of the things that this discussion is about is the question of climate change. And yet climate change is something that a lot of people don't accept as being real. And if it is real, many people argue there's really nothing that can be done about it. So I guess we should probably start at the assumptions. What exactly is climate change or global warming, and what do we think is causing it?
Well, global warming is the increase in the temperature of the Earth's atmosphere. It's caused by a couple of different things. It can be caused by greenhouse gases, by increases in CO2 and other pollutants, and burning. It could also be caused by the burning of fossil fuels. And I mean, it is real. You can see like the ice caps are melting and stuff like that. So you can see the effects of it.
Yeah, so basically, like she said, global warming is the increase in the global temperature, and some of the causes are, I would say, like deforestation, being that like one of the articles that I looked at showed how deforestation had an effect on local communities, because sometimes they can act as like a cover. So deforestation is one of the smaller things, along with some of the ones that she said, like the fossil fuels, and so.
I think it's important to note also that climate change doesn't necessarily have to exclusively talk about man-made climate change, but in this case, in modern times, it absolutely does.
So should I take it from y'all's responses that for the most part, y'all buy into the argument that humans are impacting climate change and that our actions have somehow contributed to global warming?
Yeah,
Absolutely.
definitely.
Pretty convinced. So another thing that I've heard mentioned a lot is the problem, and this is going to come up later whenever we talk about recent efforts, but the problem of methane as a greenhouse gas. Does methane also appear to be a cause of global warming, or do you think carbon is the primary concern?
I think both are cause for concern. I think carbon emissions are something that we can eliminate without eliminating food sources. So the main cause for methanol is cattle production, and as long as we want to sustain food sources, then I think carbon emissions are the one to target.
Yeah, as a Texan, I think I certainly would be willing to limit my movement before I'd be willing to limit my beef consumption. I think that's probably a safe bet. I get your point. Why has the problem of climate change been so hard to deal with then? If it is something that we basically, almost all scientists now accept that it's a problem and it's man-made, why haven't we been able to address it for the last 40 years?
I would say that the reason that it's become such a problem is because basically when I was looking up like when climate change began to become a problem and when it became like known, it was the 1900s, and that's when like basically no, but basically that's when like generating power was beginning to like get big. And I feel like that as society has advanced, so has the global climate change. And I feel like in order to successfully like tame and like control it, then we would need to like completely rebuild our society.
Well, yeah, I think that that's like the whole argument about like moving towards greener technologies and greener energy sources is that we don't want to like compromise our quality of life that we have as post-industrial civilization. So the only alternative is to change our energy sources. And, you know, we've seen in the last 30 years that that's entirely possible. It's just expensive. And that's a big part of why I think big state actors are very hesitant to move forward, because it will be a very costly transition.
And I guess that seems reasonable. Now, if an actor, let's say, for example, the United States, decided that it wanted to unilaterally take steps to confront climate change, maybe American citizens or Canadian citizens became serious about the problem, would the actions of a single country like the United States have any real effect on climate change?
No.
I think so. The United States is one of the biggest emitters of greenhouse gases, along with China. So, and I'm sure we'll get to this later, but China and the United States actually just came to a joint declaration in Glasgow. But yeah, I think it would have a great effect.
I think that it would take a step in the right direction. I think that they could set examples for other state actors. But I don't think that one country, one state actor alone would be able to like dramatically change the effect of the world, if that makes sense.
I think that when it comes to like the US specifically, I think that just like China, I think either of those countries making a pact to do better would drastically affect the globe. But a smaller state actor like Mexico is not going to make as big of an impact, as lasting an impact. Even if they do all of the things that they can, they switch entirely to green energy, they're still not making, currently they're not the larger producers of carbon emissions, and so it's not going to affect as heavily.
So, given the fact, if y'all are right, I mean, I think Ms. Bailey, your point is well taken. That there's something unique about the United States because of the size of its economy, and coming back to Ms. Wathen's argument, the fact that we have one of the more developed economies in the world, I think there's a point there. But given the fact that it's a global problem, what steps have global nations, or what steps have the countries of the world taken to try to confront climate change? And have any of these been successful?
The first one that I know of was the Montreal Protocol, and this one was actually successful. The goal of it was to get rid of ozone depleting substances, and I mean, it pretty much worked. I think this was 1987, if I'm correct. So that effort actually worked. Some of the ones after it weren't as successful, and I'll give the other girls a chance to talk about those if they want.
Yeah, so I forget which last climate change meeting it was, but there was one a few years back that they wanted to implement that. Oh shoot, no, my brain. I
can try to pick up where she left off.
Sorry.
You're fine. I would say that okay, can you repeat the question one more time?
Sure. I was just curious, and now that we've established or that you guys have argued that it would require the action of more than one actor, have governments around the world taken any steps to try to confront the problem of climate change?
I would say that they've taken the steps as in knowing that there is a problem, and knowing that the problem needs to be like stopped, or not necessarily stopped, but like controlled. And they know how like severe it's getting. So I would say that they all know that it's a problem. However, I don't. I think that I think that they're doing. I think that they're saying that they're going to do the steps necessary, but I don't think that we'll really see them doing it until like now. How the countries are scared, or the state actors are scared because of it like starting to threaten like the Paris Agreement, and becoming like over 2 degrees Celsius. Because I believe they said it was already at like 1.5 or getting to 1.5. So I think that they'll really they're I think that we will really start seeing like them act on it when it becomes closer to like the temperature. But I think that they have overall done like the first step in trying, which is like just knowing that there's a problem and knowing that they need to do something about it.
Yeah, I mean, there have been meetings on climate change since the 80s. We've known it's been a problem for a very long time at this point, and there's not been a ton of effort. There's been some. Some countries have made commitments to step back. I believe it was only just in this climate meeting, though, in Glasgow, that it was explicitly outlining fossil fuels as the cause for the rise in climate. Previously, it had only been described as gas emissions.
And also, I was just going off of what she said. That was what I was saying. Like I think that it's one of those things that kind of people forget about, maybe not necessarily like completely forget about, but I think that it's something that gets forgotten about until it becomes a problem for everyone else, or until it becomes noticeable.
So, as we mentioned, the current round is in Glasgow. It's been called COP26 because it was kind of the 26th effort. I think the last major rounds were in Kyoto and in Paris. Mm-hmm. Do any of y'all feel comfortable talking about maybe what the goals of those were, or what some of the outcomes of these rounds of negotiations were?
The goal of the Kyoto Protocol was to require countries to reduce emissions by 5% and monitor their progress, but this was very unsuccessful. None of the countries really monitored or reported back their progress, and I don't think any of the major countries actually reduced those emissions by 5%, so pretty ineffective.
Yeah, the Paris Agreement, one of the major things that they talked about was actually trying to keep the degree shift below 2 degrees. And there was several different outlines of expectations to be met. And one of the biggest things was that every time that we would meet from here on, I think it was called the Ratchet. I forget. The Ratchet Protocol, I think, is what it was called. But every time that we would meet hereafter, these expectations would increase. The pledges would become more and more impactful.
And as with Kyoto, was there any indication, or has there been any indication that states have taken the requirement seriously of the Paris Agreement?
I mean, I think there's been some improvements. There's been some limitations on CO2 emissions, but not near to what would be needed and necessary to keep below that 2 degree line.
I mean, one of the more interesting observations since both Kyoto and Paris is that one of the countries that refused to participate in the Paris Accord, the United States, has actually been the country that seems to have done the best job at limiting CO2 emissions. whereas countries like China that did participate seem to have done very little to actually control CO2 emissions. Which brings us to the current round of negotiations, COP26. What are some of the problems or some of the concerns that are being brought up by participating countries as we're discussing how we deal with the problem of global climate change?
Well, I know there was a big issue at the end of the conference. I think it was India switched up, and I think China too. I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure India switched up their language as to cutting out CO2 emissions. I think it was specifically carbon emission or coal emissions from coal. But they changed the verbiage to, instead of eliminating, they were going to cut back, which leaves a loophole for companies to slide through.
Why do you think that those two countries in particular were pushing for that specific change in the language?
I think because they're both very heavily dependent currently on coal. And it's just going to take time and a lot of money to fix that.
Anything else? Any other concerns that have been expressed by any of the countries in the world other than China or India?
Yeah, sorry, my internet cut out there for a moment. But yeah, so like I had mentioned earlier, a major thing that came out of the COP26 was a joint declaration with the United States and China. And they focused on decarbonization, reducing emissions of methane, as you were talking about earlier, and also working to combat deforestation. So this is a pretty big thing. And then there was also the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance, which was formed by Denmark and Costa Rica. And the goal of this was phasing out oil and gas production. Unfortunately, a lot of the bigger countries like Russia, China, and the United States, the biggest emitters of or drillers of oil, they didn't sign the alliance. Still a big step.
Yeah, it is a bit difficult whenever the countries that are most responsible are also the countries that are least likely to participate. Now, I know that one concern, and I'm going to share a screen here, that one concern that a number of countries have had has been, what happens if I tell people you're not allowed to increase your emissions from the current levels? So you have a country like the United States or a country like Canada that pollutes heavily per person. But then you have countries like India or Brazil that have relatively large populations, but because they have underdeveloped economies, they don't produce nearly as heavily. We talk about how China might be the world's second largest polluter of greenhouse gases, but they also have almost 3 times the population of a country like the United States. So if you say to states like India or China or Brazil or really any developing economy, you're not allowed to produce any more fossil fuel emissions, but neither is the United States. Effectively, you're saying you can't grow your economy anymore unless you're willing to spend money on really expensive energy development. Whereas the United States doesn't have to spend that money because they've already developed all their energy sectors. So I guess the question is, why should a country like India or China agree to a protocol that basically says you're never going to be allowed to improve the standard of living for your citizens because you'll never be able to afford it?
You're muted, Alyssa.
Alyssa, you're muted.
Sorry about that. I believe it was a meeting just before, not just before the Paris Agreement, but several years before, where they established that there would be a green energy fund.
Looks like we've lost Mithwathan.
Okay. So I was just gonna say that that's a really good question, because how do you like tell someone that is trying to, I feel like there should be I guess a limit maybe, or I mean, I don't really know how to answer that question, because that made me think like how, I mean, for people that are, well, for countries that are trying to like develop their economies or whatever, and they don't have much yet, I mean, already, then it's unfair, because the United States, we're already like developed, and we have so, we're using so much, and then that's a really hard question. I'm gonna let Milan answer.
No, I mean it is a hard question, and it's unfair to expect like a country like you said, like Brazil or India. Sorry, I can't remember which one you said, but to reduce their CO2 emissions and not be able to grow their economy. I don't know what Alyssa was going to finish saying, if she was going to talk about the Green Energy Fund.
I think she.
I don't know as much about that probably as she does, but I mean, if that is a thing and it does work out, then I think that could be very helpful.
Definitely.
So, what were some of the strategies that were developed at COP26 or that are included in the protocol? Because after all, if we're going to evaluate whether or not countries will be able to meet their agreements going forward, we have to talk a bit about what those agreements were. So what did they agree to?
I've seen that they. Hey. Sorry. Okay, so I've seen that. I'm sorry, I can't think straight right now. Okay, so basically, I read this article. Like it was a overview of like everything that was talked about at the at the COP26. And some of it they kind of go back to the Paris Agreement, but they were kind of like trying to move forward from the Paris Agreement. So I think that they were moving to like reduce the greenhouse gases. And I think that Paris is more so like willing to do majority of this stuff than any other country. And let me see. One of you all can go, and I'm gonna like look over this because I just had a brain fart.
Yeah. So most of the like pledges were just trying to reach the goal of the 1.5 degrees Celsius goal. So that was basically what everything was centered around, was trying to reach that mark.
So one of the strategies that was negotiated and is in the final language for the COP26 agreement, COP26 agreement, is an extension of an old idea that came out of Kyoto for carbon trading, which is an attempt to use market forces to deal with the question of climate change. Do any of you feel comfortable speaking to how carbon trading would work and whether or not it would have any impact on climate change? So the argument behind carbon trading, both from the Kyoto protocols and also from COP26, is that countries would be given certain permissions to pollute the environment. And if they didn't use those permissions themselves, they could effectively trade them in the same way that we might trade stocks or bonds on an exchange, or that we might trade commodities like corn or gasoline itself. They could trade the right to pollute to wealthier countries. The logic here being that if wealthier countries that were heavy polluters had to buy the right to pollute from poorer countries like China or India that weren't polluting as heavily, that China and India could then use that money to develop their green energy sectors. Do you guys think that something like that makes sense, that a market force like that would work, or do you think that the temptation to cheat would just be too great?
I mean, I think with any system, any goal, there's always going to be a temptation, especially on a government level. But do I think that helps to address the problem of developing countries struggling to afford green gas?
Ms. Bailey, Ms. Payton, what do you think?
sorry. Yeah, I mean, I think it could be effective in a way, but like you said, there could be some cheating. It could help out smaller countries. It's kind of just
Yeah.
could go one way or the other. It's not
Right.
really like, yes, it'll work. No, it will work. No, it won't work. There could be ways to cheat around it, but it could also be beneficial. So
I agree, but I feel like more harm will be done in the event of multiple countries cheating, because you won't truly have a way of knowing. And at that point, then you'll have countries like paying out others, and they're still using the same amount of energy that they would have used, like, I mean, well, the same amount of carbon, pollution that they would have used, like, regardless of if they traded it in or not. So I think that if anything, if I think that if there was a way of like, if it was a way of like saying or telling okay, I can't get my words together. If there was a way of truly like knowing, okay, if I give this money, I mean, yeah, if I give them this money, then they won't use, a certain amount, then okay, yeah. But if there's no way of truly knowing like how much they're using, or if they're trying to like meet up to the agreement, then I think that it would do more harm than good, because then it would just be a lot of pollution and nobody would really be able to track how much is going into the environment.
Another question that was addressed in COP26, and again, debates around whether or not state actors will follow up on this. In some of the earlier rounds, there had been agreements by wealthier countries like the United States or European Union countries to provide wealth transfers, either cash payments or technology transfers to developing countries to the tune of about $100 billion, very little of which was actually transferred between the last agreements in Kyoto and Paris and in the current agreement. Now, without surprise, during COP26, the developing countries agreed to give even more money, but there are very few protocols by which we can enforce the transfer of this wealth. Do you feel like it would be necessary to require or mandate some kind of a transfer, specific transfers? And if so, how would you force the United States to give a country like Costa Rica cash in order to develop their economy?
Personally, I think we should not cash. Build back.
Melissa, you're breaking
our.
up.
Oh, sorry. Sorry. Can you hear me?
Kind
I was gonna say, I've lost.
I'm sorry.
Milan, Haley, why don't y'all give it a shot?
Okay, can you repeat the question again, please?
Sure. So how do you force countries like the United States to actually provide wealth to developing countries, as they've agreed to in previous agreements, but didn't really live up to, and as they've agreed to once again in the COP26 agreement?
I feel like if everyone's trying to get to this agreement, or if everyone is trying to meet in the middle, then I feel like some countries have to be willing to like sacrifice things that they don't want to sacrifice, which in this case it could be money. But I feel like in order to get to the end goal, then countries are going to have to sacrifice something to get there. It's not just going to be countries that don't have much that are going to be able to like fully do things that like the United States, for example, will be able to do because they have more money, unfortunately.
I was going to say that I think that maybe not giving monetary incentives, but actually like helping to build factories or nuclear power plants, things that are eco-friendly would be a better way to address that.
yeah, I was gonna say. Oh, sorry, Dr. Williams.
Please go ahead.
I was going to say it is difficult to enforce that. That's one of the main problems with like treaties and agreements, is that there's not really a international like force that's there to enforce the things. It's difficult to enforce them.
Well, and that brings us to the final question. We're just about out of time. in the final balance, given what you've learned about the previous global agreements, what do you think the chances of success are, either of COP26 in reducing the effects of global warming, or in general? Do you think that it's possible for humans to actually do anything to confront this global crisis?
It's possible for humans. I don't know that it's logical to assume that government will. Possible, but I think only a few good men and women.
But I don't think that humans will be able to do it on their own. They'll need the government to be behind them for it to actually be effective. So with that being said, honestly, I think that, like I said before, I think that this is something that is overlooked a lot until we see it affecting something major, or like until the president sees that all his trees in the front yard are burnt down or something. Like, I don't know. I think that something major has to happen for these countries to actually take it serious, which is the sad thing. So until then, I would say that this is just going to be another problem that keeps being discussed and not actually acted upon. Because unfortunately, one state actor like Paris and the Paris Agreement is not going to be able, it's not enough to help with global climate change all over the world.
Yeah, I agree with them. I don't think we're going to be seeing much real change. I hate to be such a pessimist. Like, I would love to be like, yay, we're going to see climate change, go away, and it's just going to get better. But, which, I mean, it could happen. A lot of youth in the world are really taking charge, and it's great. But the problem is that they're just youths. They're not, like, in the government, and the government isn't really listening to them. Like, they're giving them a chance to shine, but they're not really actually listening. And they care more about, the economy and stuff like that than the earth dying in a year or 100 years. So I don't expect any real change coming soon. Maybe 5 years, 10 years, but not right now.
Yeah.
And by that point, it honestly might be a little late because the Paris Agreement will be out the window and it'll be at 2 or surpassing 2 by then.
I share your sentiment, Ms. Bailey. I hate to be a pessimist, but I'm now looking at my third generation of youth that have said that they would fix climate change. And the people who are in charge right now were once youth saying they would fix climate change. And now that they're in charge, they seem to be doing very little about it. And unfortunately, on that upbeat note, we're going to have to end there. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. If you joined live or if you join us later as the pre-recorded live stream. We have one more of these, which will be held in about 3 weeks for the senior seminar class. And I hope you're able to join us then. And until next time, God bless.